Recently, I found a podcast that shared something interesting about Superman.
It's the Egyptian one about Osiris, like the power of the sun, the same thing. It's all a bunch of black stuff.
Then he talked a bit more about the connection that superheroes have with Afro-descendant culture. For example, he mentions the influence that the X-Men took from historical figures like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. How is it that Stan Lee once said that the Blade movies had saved Marvel from bankruptcy? And how the movie Black Panther had become a huge critical and commercial success? Some of his points are true, others are half-truths, but the topic is interesting, so I thought it was a good idea to revisit his arguments. In this video, to find out what is real and what isn't about his statements. According to the history of superheroes, that is, could it be that the true origin of Superman is Egyptian? Did Blade save Marvel from bankruptcy? And are Charles Xavier and Magneto really based on Martin Luther King and Malcolm X? So here I tell you the truth. Let's get started. Let's start with the first thing. What is this podcast and who are the people behind this show? The podcast is called 154, and in its official description, they mention that it is a podcast dedicated to sharing the untold stories of African artists, athletes, and business leaders. In this episode, for example, the hosts Akbar and Godfrey had Jimmy Akinbola as a guest who recently appeared in the series Bel Air. You may not remember it, so let me remind you, it was a serious, dramatic remake of the series known in Latin America as The Fresh Prince of Bel Air. Let's say it was a Snyderized version of the series, so, well, the concept of the podcast is to focus on African culture and in this particular segment. They wanted to talk about how Western culture has taken many things, let's say, borrowed, from people of African descent without giving them the credit they deserve. Is this true? I think we can explain this point very well using the movie Sinners as an example. The movie Sinners works as a metaphor for how rock and roll replaced rhythm and blues. Watch it. In this way, the film tells us that there are people who are able to travel and rise through time thanks to the musical energy they transmit. Is this something we see in the character of Preacher Boy? But his musical energy also has another consequence, since it attracted white vampires who wanted to take it for themselves. And this feels like a very accurate analogy of what happened with blues in the real world. During the 1930s and 1940s, blues music became faster and more danceable, which gave rise to what was then known as rhythm and blues, a genre that became very popular among both young African Americans and whites. However, despite its popularity, it was still considered race music, meaning music that was only supposed to be for African Americans. But here's the question: what weighs more, racial prejudice or money? This was when the record labels decided to create their own white musical genre, called rock and roll. A genre that musically was identical to rhythm and blues, but was performed by white artists like Bill Haley and Elvis Presley. So much so that many of the first rock and roll hits were covers of rhythm and blues songs from 10 years earlier. So think of the record labels as these vampires, who wanted to take over a music that wasn't theirs. In the words of the artist Fats Domino in 1957, "What they now call rock and roll is rhythm and blues, and I've been playing it for 15 years in New Orleans." Rock and roll eventually evolved into various genres, with artists worldwide shaping the movement into what we now call rock, a genre with its own identity. But the movie Sinners serves as a great reminder of how a large part of the music we listen to today was born from Afro-descendant culture. Does this mean this part of the podcast is true? Now let's discuss what they said about Superman.
Superman is the Egyptian about Osiris, like the power of the sun. It's all a bunch of black things.
Superman is based on an Egyptian story. What do you say, true or false? When did Superman first appear? He was considered a completely innovative character because of his mix of action, powers, and science fiction, which made him the first true superhero. He didn't just appear in comics. Like any cultural product, he drew from others, such as Doc Savage, the powerless man of bronze. He was also named Clark and also had a fortress of solitude, but the greatest influence on the character didn't come from other comics but from mythological stories. In this sketch, which was drawn years before the first Superman story was published, he is described as a Hercules in strength. And biblical stories were a very important inspiration, since from his first appearance, Superman told us the story of a divine figure who was sent from the heavens to help humanity, just like the story of Jesus. Careful here, because at first this wasn't intentional. That is, his original creators weren't trying to imitate Jesus. It just happened. It happened unconsciously. You might think it's just a coincidence, but it happens more often than you'd expect. And according to the theory of comparative mythology, human beings tend to write similar stories because we share the same fears, hopes, and above all, the same questions. That's why, for example, the sun works as Superman's source of power. It was a symbol used to represent the power and divinity of other figures, like Jesus, Apollo, or the Egyptian god Ra, through the solar crown. Another similarity can be found in the theme of resurrection, since Osiris, Jesus, and Superman all managed to rise from the dead. And another similarity can be found in the theme of conception. Horus was conceived by magical means, and Jesus was conceived by a virgin. And in John Byrne's run of Superman, we're told that Kryptonians didn't have relationships to conceive, but did so through a technological matrix. In fact, Jor-El himself confirms that his seed and Lara's were mixed in the matrix, which also speaks to us of a virgin conception. That's why I think this statement is partially true. Since Superman is not directly inspired by Egyptian culture, but rather by biblical stories that take many elements from this mythology. Now, how much the story of Jesus was inspired, consciously or unconsciously, by other stories that came before, that's a separate topic. In this case, what interests me are stories. If you want to learn about the origins and evolution of superheroes, I'll have an online course on their history in a couple of weeks. It's a completely live online course with me, where we'll learn how these characters emerged, how they changed over the years, and how they became the cultural icons we know today. The course is up to date, so we'll also talk about topics related to James Gunn's Detective Comics universe and Avengers Zoomday. These will be the schedules we'll have, and the final session will be a bit longer because we'll stay a while to hang out and chat. You'll get the session recordings, the PDF materials, and an updated reading guide with top comics from each era. I'll share ways to get these comics during the course. If you want to reserve a spot, the link is in the video description. And a discount coupon that expires on February 10th, so you can take advantage of it. This is the last discount I'll be offering, so I hope to see you there. Now, let's get back to the topic.
Goodbye his office for 3 hours. He goes, Godfrey, I want to show you something. Here, you see this picture of Wesley Snipes? He's the reason why Marvel got out of bankruptcy. It was him.
What do you think? Did Blade save Marvel from bankruptcy? To answer that, we first need to discuss how Marvel went bankrupt. It turns out that at the end of the 80s, Marvel Comics went from being a simple company that published superhero comics to becoming an entertainment corporation. It bought toy companies, collectible card companies, and was listed on the stock market. But this growth started to affect it in the stories, since the company began to see superheroes only as intellectual properties that could sell merchandise. In fact, even the artist John Romita said that the executives would tell the writers and artists, "You only deserve 1% of our time." But soon everything collapsed. On one hand, the bad stories started to drive away regular consumers, and on the other hand, Marvel. Marvel started to drive away comic collectors and speculators by massively printing every issue, which made speculators no longer see any value in the comics. In the end, Marvel was too big for a shrinking market and went bankrupt. Afterwards, Marvel restructured and decided to sell the rights to their characters to movie companies. Sony bought Spider-Man, Fox bought the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, and New Line Cinema bought Blade. But it seems strange to me that Stan specifically said that Blade saved Marvel from bankruptcy, because it was really the sale of all these properties that saved Marvel. Blade was commercially successful, but Marvel didn't earn extra profits from its box office. However, Blade does have great merit, since the success of this movie served to prove that superhero movies could be profitable and successful. So we could even say that the Marvel Cinematic Universe was possible thanks to the success that Blade had. So I would say this is false. Blade by itself didn't get Marvel out of bankruptcy, but it definitely did a lot for superheroes and for pop culture, and I think that's worth more. Now on to the last point from the podcast. Are Charles Xavier and Magneto truly inspired by Martin Luther King and Malcolm X? This isn't easy to answer, but let me explain. In interviews, Stan Lee claimed he created the concept of mutants. For practicality, that is, to be able to easily introduce several characters without having to think about the origin of each of their powers.
And those who haven't become a kind of humanity.
But Stan also talked about how, for him, it was important that the X-Men were a symbol of something bigger.
I thought it might be fun to make an analogy with the way some people are picked on by bigots. What if the human race is afraid of them, hates them perhaps, and persecutes them?
Something we can clearly see in stories like X-Men 14 from 1965, where Dr. Bolivar Trask publicly says that mutants are a threat, and he develops the Sentinel program to eliminate them. So, is it a fact that the X-Men have symbolized the struggle of a minority against intolerance from the very beginning? But is there really a connection with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X? These first X-Men comics were written in the mid-60s, a time when Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were very strong leaders in the fight for civil rights in the United States, which aimed to end racial segregation. But both had very different approaches. Martin wanted to integrate African Americans into the American community. He spoke in his speeches about respect, tolerance, and called for civil disobedience, characteristics that we can see reflected in Charles Xavier. Meanwhile, Malcolm X had a more separatist vision, and although he did not call for violence, he did call for self-defense and felt that African Americans had to look out for each other, an approach that we could associate more with Magneto. However, during this time, neither Stan Lee nor Jack Kirby spoke directly about this comparison. It wasn't until more recent times that Stan Lee mentioned this in interviews like the one with Rolling Stone, where he said, "I think it was something unconscious. I never felt that Magneto was 100% evil. There were reasons why he thought the way he did. But it was Professor X's job to find a way to make him understand that he was on the wrong path. So we don't really know for sure if it was an unconscious association on Stan Lee's part or just pure coincidence." But can we deny that cultural products are a reflection of the times we live in? And in this case, the X-Men certainly represented this struggle of a minority against oppression very well. So let's say that some points are true, others have some truth to them, and others are more of a conjecture. But I understand the point the podcast was trying to make because yes, I think we tend to think of superheroes as an American cultural product. We often forget that people of African descent are a key part of this population. So they also played a very important role in the evolution of all these iconic characters beyond their skin color. These topics are covered in detail in my History of Superheroes course, so if you enjoy them, I'd love to have you join my class. They are online and live with 4 2-hour sessions. Find the link and discount coupon in the description. That's it for today. I'm G.O. the Geek Monitor. Keep looking beyond the obvious.